The metal walls of the research ship Starweaver hummed with quiet power as it drifted through the darkness between stars. Deep inside the vessel, Zareth moved through the corridors with the fluid grace that marked her as one of the galaxy's most feared predators. Her 8-foot frame cast long shadows under the bright lights, and other crew members stepped aside when they saw her coming. This was normal. This was how things had always been. Zareth had been conducting first contact evaluations for over 30 years. She had tested 47 different species, watching how they reacted when faced with a true apex predator. The patterns were always the same. First came the fear response. Elevated heart rates, stress hormones flooding their systems, defensive postures. Then came the respect, the careful politeness that all prey species showed when they understood what stood before them. It was a dance as old as evolution itself, and Zareth knew all the steps. Today would be different, though she did not know it yet. The examination chamber was a sterile white room with a simple table and 2 chairs. Monitoring equipment lined the walls, ready to measure every biological response from the subject. Zareth settled into her chair, her natural armor plates shifting slightly as she made herself comfortable. The chair groaned under her weight, but held firm. Everything in this room had been built to accommodate species much larger and stronger than the soft creatures that usually sat across from her. The door slid open with a soft whisper, and Jake Miller walked in. He was unremarkable in every way that mattered to a predator's eye. Average height for his species, maybe 5 feet and 10 inches tall. Thin build with no visible muscle mass. Pale skin that would tear easily under claws. Brown hair that fell in an untidy mess around his face. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt and dark pants that had seen better days. In one hand, he carried a worn notebook, and in the other, a pencil that looked like it had been chewed on. Jake looked around the room with curious eyes, taking in the monitoring equipment and the reinforced walls. He showed no sign of concern about being locked in a small space with something that could kill him in seconds. Instead, he smiled politely at Zareth and took his seat across from her. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and friendly. "I'm Jake Miller. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me." Zareth studied him carefully. Her enhanced senses could detect the smallest changes in body chemistry, the tiny signals that revealed fear, aggression, or deception. Jake showed none of these. His heart rate was steady and slow. His breathing was relaxed. His posture was open and unthreatening. If she had not known better, she would have thought he was meeting a friend for coffee rather than facing evaluation by a creature designed by evolution to hunt and kill. "I am Zareth of the Veltari," she replied, letting a slight growl enter her voice. Most species flinched when they heard that sound. Jake simply nodded and opened his notebook. "Veltari," he repeated, writing something down. "That's a beautiful name. Does it have a meaning in your language?" The question caught Zareth off guard. In 3 decades of conducting these evaluations, no one had ever asked her about linguistics. They were usually too busy trying not to wet themselves with fear. "It means those who hunt in darkness," she said slowly. Jake's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "That's fascinating. Your homeworld must have some unique environmental conditions to produce such specialized hunters. Are you primarily nocturnal, or is the darkness more metaphorical?" Zareth stared at him. She had described herself using a name that literally meant nightmare predator, and this soft little human was asking follow-up questions like a curious student. She could smell no deception on him, no false bravado. He truly seemed more interested in learning about her culture than in protecting himself from her claws. "We hunt at all hours," she said carefully. "The darkness refers to our ability to move unseen, to strike from shadows." "Remarkable adaptation," Jake murmured, making more notes. "I study plant life myself, so I'm always amazed by how different species evolve to fill specific ecological niches." Your people must be incredibly efficient predators to develop such sophisticated hunting techniques. He spoke about her lethal nature, the way he might discuss the weather, with casual interest, but no emotional investment. Zarath felt something strange stirring in her chest, an unfamiliar sensation that took her a moment to identify. Uncertainty. For the first time in her adult life, she was not sure how to proceed with a first contact evaluation. The standard protocol was simple: display dominance, establish the natural hierarchy, and then move through a series of psychological tests designed to measure intelligence, aggression, and potential threat level. Every species she had encountered followed predictable patterns in response to her presence. They either showed appropriate fear and submission, or they attempted to display their own dominance through aggression. Both responses made sense from an evolutionary perspective. Jake Miller was doing neither. Instead, he was sketching something in his notebook while humming softly under his breath. The tune was pleasant and simple, the kind of melody that spoke of peaceful moments and quiet contentment. He glanced up at her occasionally, not with the quick, nervous looks of prey checking for danger, but with the relaxed attention of someone enjoying a conversation. "I hope you don't mind me asking," Jake said, looking up from his drawing, "but are those natural armor plates, or do your people use some kind of technological enhancement? The way the light reflects off them is quite beautiful." Beautiful. He had called her armored carapace beautiful. Zarath's plates were designed to deflect energy weapons and projectiles. They were black as space with a subtle blue sheen that helped her blend into shadows. They were tools of war, not objects of artistic appreciation. "They are natural," she managed to say. "Incredible," Jake said, returning to his sketch. The evolutionary pressure required to develop such sophisticated biological armor must have been intense. Your ancestors faced some serious threats. He was right, of course. The Veltari homeworld was a nightmare of competing predators, each one designed by millions of years of evolution to kill more efficiently than the last. Only the strongest, fastest, and most ruthless had survived to pass on their genes. Zarath was the end result of that process, a perfect killing machine wrapped in a form that struck terror into the hearts of lesser species. But Jake Miller was not a lesser species, apparently. He was something else entirely, something that did not fit into any of the categories that Zarath understood. He sat in her presence without fear, spoke to her without deference, and looked at her without the careful respect that every other sentient being had learned to show. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft scratching of Jake's, pencil against paper, and his quiet humming. Zarath realized that she was going to have to take more direct action if she wanted to get a proper response from this strange human. The standard protocols were clearly insufficient. Time to show Jake Miller what a real predator looked like. Zarath made her decision. She would have to escalate beyond the standard first contact protocols. This human needed to understand what he was dealing with, and she was going to make sure he got the message clearly. She began by activating her natural threat display, something she had never needed to do in a first contact situation before. The change started in her chest, where specialized organs pumped chemicals through her bloodstream. Her black armor plates began to shift color, darkening to deep crimson that seemed to pulse with inner fire. Bioluminescent patterns flowed along, her arms like liquid lightning, creating hypnotic spirals that had evolved to confuse prey before the killing strike. Jake looked up from his notebook, watching the display with the same curious interest he had shown when asking about her name. He tilted his head slightly, studying the light patterns as they moved across her skin. "Oh, wow," he said quietly. "That's absolutely incredible. Are you communicating something specific, or is this more of a general threat display?" Zarath's claws extended with a soft snick of metal on keratin. 8 inches of razor-sharp bone that could punch through starship hulls emerged from her fingertips. The claws had been honed by countless battles, and were stained with the blood of creatures that had thought themselves apex predators until they met her. Jake glanced at the claws, then back to her face. Those look incredibly sharp. I bet they're useful for more than just hunting. Do you use them for crafting or tool work as well? The casual tone of his question made Zarath's chest tight with something that might have been panic. She released her combat pheromones, flooding the small chamber with chemical signals that triggered every prey animal's deepest instinctual fears. The scent was designed to cause immediate paralysis in most species, a biological weapon that made her prey freeze in terror long enough for her to close the distance and finish them. Jake sniffed once, looking thoughtful. Interesting smell. Is that part of your hunting strategy? Some kind of chemical communication? Stop, Zarath said, her voice coming out as a low growl that vibrated through the metal walls. Stop asking questions and react properly. Jake blinked, in surprise. React to what? You're showing me some really fascinating biological adaptations, but I'm not sure what kind of reaction you're looking for. Frustration boiled up in Zarath's chest, hot and unfamiliar. She had never encountered a being so completely immune to her natural advantages. Every part of her had been shaped by evolution to inspire terror, and this soft human was treating her like a museum exhibit. She leaned forward, placing her clawed hands on the metal table between them. The sharp points left gouges in the reinforced surface as she shifted her weight. Her massive frame cast Jake in shadow, and she let her full predatory presence fill the space between them. Listen carefully, human, she said, her voice dropping to the subsonic frequencies that could stop a heart with fear. My species has a 97% success rate as galactic peacekeepers. We are requested by name when other enforcement agencies fail. Do you know why? Jake shook his head, genuinely interested in her answer. Because we are perfect killers, Zarath continued, her words carefully chosen for maximum impact. I could tear your throat out with my claws before you could blink. I could crush your skull like an egg with my bare hands. I could break every bone in your body and leave you alive to feel each fracture. I know 12 different ways to stop your heart, 15 ways to cause paralysis, and 23 ways to inflict pain so severe that death would be a relief. She paused, watching his face for any sign that her words were having the desired effect. Jake listened with the same polite attention he had shown throughout their conversation, occasionally nodding as she described various methods of execution. Your species has never faced anything like mine, Zarath pressed on. We have conquered worlds. We have broken civilizations that thought themselves untouchable. When others flee from nightmares, those nightmares flee from us. I am death-walking in living form, and you sit here sketching pictures like we are sharing tea. Jake finished writing something in his notebook and looked up at her. His brown eyes were calm and thoughtful, showing no trace of the terror that should have been consuming him by now. That sounds like a terrible burden, he said softly. It must be lonely, having everyone afraid of you all the time. The words hit Zarath like a physical blow. In all her years of conducting evaluations, through all the fear and respect and careful politeness, no one had ever expressed sympathy for her situation. The idea that her strength might be a source of isolation, rather than pride, had never occurred to her. I am not seeking sympathy, she said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. I know, Jake replied, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve it. Being that powerful, that feared, it must make it hard to form real connections with people. Zarath stared at him, feeling like the conversation had somehow gotten away from her completely. She was supposed to be establishing dominance, demonstrating the natural order that placed predators above prey. Instead, this human was looking at her with something that might have been compassion. She tried one more direct approach. Rising from her chair, she moved around the table until she loomed directly over Jake. Her full height and mass should have triggered every survival instinct the human possessed. Her claws were inches from his face, her combat pheromones were thick in the air, and her threat display was at maximum intensity. Jake craned his neck back to look up at her, completely unbothered by her proximity. If anything, he seemed concerned that she might be uncomfortable standing at such an awkward angle. "Human," Zareth said, her voice carrying every ounce of menace she could manage. The subsonic frequencies made the walls vibrate, and her words seemed to come from some primordial darkness where nightmares were born. "Aren't you afraid of me?" Jake considered the question seriously, his head tilted thoughtfully as he looked up into her predatory face. When he answered, his voice was quiet and genuinely puzzled, as if her question confused him on some fundamental level. "Should I be?" he asked. "You haven't given me any reason to think you'd hurt me." The simple honesty of his response sent a chill down Zareth's spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a complete inability to understand what she was dealing with. In that moment, looking down at this unremarkable human who showed no more concern for her lethal capabilities than he might for a house cat, Zareth felt something she had never experienced before. She felt afraid. Not afraid that Jake would hurt her. That was impossible. Not afraid that he was concealing some hidden weapon or ability, her senses would have detected any deception. She was afraid because she had just encountered something that did not fit into any category she understood, something that responded to the fundamental rules of predator and prey in ways that made no evolutionary sense. Jake Miller was not brave in the way that warriors were brave, facing danger with gritted teeth and determined courage. He was not foolish in the way that young creatures were foolish, too inexperienced to recognize threats. He was something else entirely, something that looked at her capacity for violence and simply did not process it as relevant to their interaction. Zareth backed away from him slowly, returning to her chair with movements that felt suddenly uncertain. For the first time in her adult life, she was not sure what to do next. Every protocol she had been trained to follow assumed that other species would react to her presence in predictable ways. Jake Miller was reacting in no way at all. He had gone back to his sketching, humming that same pleasant tune while he worked. Occasionally, he would glance up at her with a friendly smile, as if checking to make sure she was comfortable. It was the kind of casual attention that one might pay to a companion during a quiet afternoon, not the careful monitoring that prey species used to track potential predators. Zareth realized that she was going to have to completely rethink her approach to this evaluation. Nothing in her training had prepared her for a species that simply did not acknowledge the basic rules of survival that governed every other form of intelligent life in the galaxy. Jake Miller was something new, something that did not fit into the established order of things, and that thought terrified her more than any enemy she had ever faced in battle. After Jake left the examination room, Zareth sat alone for a long time, staring at the gouges her claws had left in the metal table. She had conducted thousands of interviews, evaluated dozens of species, and written reports that shaped galactic policy for centuries. Never once had she felt so completely out of her depth. She needed answers, and she knew where to find them. The ship's database contained detailed records on every known species in the galaxy. Zareth called up the human files and began reading with the systematic thoroughness that had made her one of the Federation's most trusted analysts. What she found made no sense at all. Humans came from a world called Earth, a mild planet with comfortable temperatures and abundant resources. They had evolved not as apex predators but as social hunters, working together to bring down prey much larger than themselves. Their physical capabilities were unremarkable. Average strength, average speed, average senses. By every measure that mattered in the galactic community, they should have been a minor species destined for subjugation by their betters. Instead, their history was filled with individuals who had faced extinction-level threats with curiosity, rather than terror. Zareth found records of human explorers who had walked calmly into environments that would kill them within minutes, simply to see what was there. She read about scientists who had worked with deadly diseases and radioactive materials, accepting death as a reasonable price for knowledge. She discovered accounts of humans who had deliberately placed themselves between predators and other humans, knowing they would die but hoping to save someone else. None of it made evolutionary sense. Fear existed for a reason. It kept creatures alive long enough to reproduce and pass on their genes. A species that routinely ignored survival instincts should have died out within a few generations. Yet humans had not only survived but thrived, spreading across their solar system and now venturing out into the galaxy. Zareth decided she needed to interview Jake again, but this time she would approach the conversation differently. Instead of trying to establish dominance, she would try to understand what made his species so fundamentally different from everything else she had encountered. When Jake returned to the examination room the next day, he seemed pleased to see her again. He settled into his chair with the same relaxed manner as before, pulling out his notebook and offering her another of those genuine smiles that seemed to have no agenda behind them. "I hope you don't mind," he said, opening the notebook to show her his sketch from the previous day. "I finished drawing you last night. I wanted to capture those light patterns. They really were beautiful." The drawing was surprisingly good, showing Zareth in her full threat display with her bioluminescent markings flowing across her arms. But instead of emphasizing her predatory nature, Jake had somehow made her look almost graceful, like a dancer, caught in mid-movement rather than a killer preparing to strike. "You have artistic talent," Zareth said, studying the image. "Thank you," Jake replied. "My sister Amy is the real artist in the family, but I enjoy sketching plants and animals. It helps me understand how different species adapt to their environments," Zareth seized on this opening. "Tell me about your sister." Jake's face lit up with genuine warmth. "Amy is amazing. She's 3 years older than me and works with wildlife rehabilitation on Earth. She has this incredible gift for helping injured animals recover from trauma." "What kind of animals?" Zareth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "All kinds," Jake said enthusiastically. "Last year she nursed a wolf back to health after it was hit by a transport vehicle. The month before that she helped relocate a family of bears that had wandered into a residential area. She says the key is showing them that you're not a threat, that you want to help rather than harm." A wolf. Jake's sister had voluntarily placed herself in close contact with a creature designed by evolution to kill things exactly like her. Zareth pulled up Earth's biological records and felt her understanding of the universe shift slightly. Wolves were pack hunters with powerful jaws and sharp teeth, capable of bringing down prey much larger than a human. They were, in their own way, apex predators. "Were your family not concerned for her safety?" Zareth asked. Jake looked puzzled by the question. "Why would we be? Amy knows what she's doing and the wolf needed help. You can't just leave an injured animal to suffer because it might be dangerous." "But wolves kill humans," Zareth pointed out. "Sometimes," Jake agreed. "But humans kill wolves too, and we're supposed to be the intelligent ones. Amy figures that if we're smart enough to build starships, we should be smart enough to help other species instead of fearing them." Zareth made notes in her own report, trying to capture the casual way Jake discussed interacting with deadly predators. She asked him about other examples, and the stories that emerged painted a picture of a species that seemed determined to ignore every lesson that evolution had tried to teach them. Jake told her about his friend Pete, who went swimming, with great white sharks as a hobby, not in protective cages or with weapons, but simply diving into the ocean to observe them in their natural habitat. When Zareth asked why Pete was not eaten, Jake explained that sharks rarely attacked humans unless they felt threatened or confused them for their normal prey. "Pete says the key is moving slowly and calmly," Jake explained. "If you're not acting like prey, they don't treat you like prey." The logic was so simple that it made Zareth's head spin. Instead of avoiding predators or establishing dominance over them, Humans simply chose not to trigger their hunting instincts. It was like deliberately stepping into a minefield and then carefully avoiding the mines instead of finding a safer path. She asked about his grandmother Helen and learned that the elderly human had kept venomous snakes as pets, not for protection or as weapons, but because she found them interesting. When one of the snakes bit her, Helen's primary concern had been making sure it was not injured by her reflexive movement. Grandmother Helen always said that most dangerous animals only attack when they're scared or protecting themselves, Jake said. If you give them space and respect their boundaries, they're usually content to leave you alone. Zareth was beginning to understand something that chilled her to her core. Humans did not fear predators because they did not see them as enemies. They saw them as fellow inhabitants of the universe, deserving of the same consideration and respect that humans showed to each other. To test this theory, she showed Jake footage from the ship's database, recordings of the galaxy's most feared species in action. She started with the Shardkai, crystalline warriors who could slice through starship hulls with their natural weapons. The footage showed them in battle, their bodies refracting light into deadly beams as they carved their way through enemy forces. Jake watched with fascination rather than horror. "Do they feel pain when their crystal bodies are damaged?" he asked. The question caught Zareth completely off guard. "I do not know," she admitted. "It would be interesting to find out," Jake mused. "If they do experience pain, their healing methods might be completely different from biological species. I wonder if they regenerate or if they have to replace damaged sections entirely." He was looking at footage of creatures that had conquered star systems and wondering about their medical needs. Zareth showed him recordings of the Void Hunters, space-dwelling predators that fed on the energy of dying stars. Jake asked if they migrated seasonally and whether they had families. She showed him the hive mind clusters, collective intelligences that had assimilated entire civilizations. Jake wondered if individual members of the collective retained any personal identity and whether they missed their original forms. Every single time, his first response was curiosity about their well-being rather than concern for his own safety. Even when faced with creatures that could destroy planets, Jake's instinct was to understand and empathize rather than fear and fight. Other crew members began reporting their own encounters with Jake, and the stories only reinforced Zareth's growing sense of unease. The ship's Korthax engineer mentioned that Jake had offered to help repair a plasma conduit with his bare hands while the system was still active. When told it would kill him instantly, Jake had asked if there was protective equipment he could use, so he could help anyway. The ship's AI reported that Jake had struck up casual conversations during his wanderings through the corridors, asking if it ever felt lonely and whether there was anything he could do to make its existence more enjoyable. Most disturbing of all, Jake had apparently tried to pet the ship's security creature, a bioengineered nightmare designed to repel borders with its toxic secretions and razor-sharp spines. He had approached it slowly and calmly, speaking in soothing tones until the creature allowed him to scratch behind its sensory organs. Zareth realized that she was not dealing with an anomaly or a particularly brave individual. Jake Miller was a representative example of his species, and that meant there was an entire world full of beings who responded to danger with compassion instead of aggression. For the first time in her life, Zareth began to understand what it meant to be truly afraid. Zareth knew she needed to design a test that would finally show Jake Miller what she truly was. Not the researcher he had been talking with, not the curious alien he seemed to find so fascinating, but the weapon that millions of years of evolution had created. She needed him to see her as she really was, a perfect killing machine that existed to hunt and destroy. She arranged for Jake to observe a combat training exercise. The ship's security team regularly ran boarding scenarios to keep their skills sharp, and Zareth often participated to demonstrate proper technique. This time would be different. This time, she would hold nothing back. The training deck was a large space filled with obstacles and barriers that could be reconfigured to simulate different environments. For this exercise, the computer had created a maze of corridors similar to those found on most civilian vessels. The scenario was simple. Hostile forces had boarded a civilian transport, and the security team needed to neutralize them without harming any innocent passengers. Jake arrived a few minutes before the IB exercise began, settling into the observation booth with the same relaxed manner he brought to everything. He had his notebook with him, as always, and seemed genuinely excited to watch Zarath demonstrate her natural abilities. "I've never seen actual combat before," he told her as she prepared for the exercise. "Well, except in recordings. I imagine it's quite different when you're actually there." Zarath nodded grimly. "It is nothing like the recordings," she said. "When you see me in action, you will understand what my species truly is." The exercise began with Zarath positioned at one end of the maze, while 6 security team members took positions throughout the corridors as hostile boarders. They were armed with training weapons that would register hits without causing permanent damage, and they wore full combat armor designed to protect them from her natural weapons. Zarath moved into the maze like liquid shadow, her body flowing through the narrow spaces with impossible grace. Her armor plates had shifted to matte black, making her nearly invisible in the dim lighting. She used her claws to climb walls and ceilings, approaching her targets from angles they could not possibly expect. The first security officer never knew what hit him. Zarath dropped from above, her claws punching through his armor like paper. The training sensors registered a kill shot, and red lights began flashing around his position. He was out of the exercise in less than 2 seconds. The second and third officers tried to work together, covering each other's backs as they moved through the corridor. Zarath moved faster than their enhanced vision could track, striking both of them simultaneously. Her claws opened their armor like cans, and her speed created sonic booms that shattered the artificial windows lining the corridor. By the time she reached the 4th officer, word had spread through the team's communication system. They knew she was coming, knew what she was capable of, and had positioned themselves accordingly. It made no difference. Zarath's roar shattered their concentration and their equipment, and she was among them before the sound had finished echoing through the corridors. The 5th officer managed to get off a few shots with his training weapon, but Zarath's armor deflected them effortlessly. She moved through his defensive fire like it was not there, closing the distance between them in a single bound. Her claws found the weak points in his armor with surgical precision, and he joined his colleagues in defeat. The final officer had barricaded himself in what the computer designated as a passenger area, surrounded by holographic civilians that the training scenario required him to protect. Zarath approached this obstacle with the same methodical efficiency she had shown throughout the exercise. She analyzed the barrier, identified its structural weaknesses, and dismantled it piece by piece until she could reach the officer inside. When it was over, 6 highly trained security professionals lay scattered throughout the maze, their armor torn open and their weapons useless. The exercise had lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds from start to finish. Zarath had not received so much as a scratch in return. She made her way back to the observation booth, her armor plate still flushed with the heat of combat and her breathing slightly elevated from the exertion. This was how she truly looked. Not the curious researcher that Jake had been talking with, but a creature designed by nature to kill without mercy or hesitation. She expected to find Jake cowering in the corner, finally understanding what he had been sitting across from all this time. She expected fear, respect, maybe even worship of her superior capabilities. Instead, she found him looking concerned. "Are you hurt?" Jake asked, rising from his chair as she entered the booth. His eyes were scanning her form, looking for signs of injury. "That looked incredibly intense. You were moving so fast, I was worried you might have strained something." Zarath stared at him. She had just demonstrated abilities that would have sent most civilized beings into shock, and Jake was worried that she might have pulled a muscle. "I am unharmed," she said slowly. "Good," Jake replied, settling back into his chair with visible relief. "I have to say, that was absolutely amazing to watch. The way you moved through those corridors, it was like watching a dancer who happened to be incredibly deadly. There's a real artistry to how you approach combat." Artistry. He was describing her killing techniques as art. "Did you see how I tore through their armor?" Zareth asked, desperate to get some kind of appropriate response from him. "I did," Jake nodded. "Your claws are incredibly precise. I noticed you were very careful to hit only the spots that would disable them without causing permanent damage. That must take enormous skill and control." He was right, of course. Training exercises required her to pull her strikes, to demonstrate lethality without actually killing her teammates. But Jake was interpreting her restraint as compassion rather than regulation compliance. "I could have killed them all," Zareth said. "But you didn't," Jake pointed out. "You showed exactly the level of force needed to complete the objective without unnecessary harm. That kind of precision under pressure is remarkable." Zareth felt that strange chill running down her spine again. Jake had watched her demonstrate the abilities that made her species the galaxy's most feared enforcers, and his takeaway was that she had shown restraint and compassion. "You saw me roar," she said. "You saw how it shattered their equipment and broke their concentration." "I did," Jake agreed. "It was incredibly powerful. Does it hurt your throat to produce sounds at that frequency? I imagine the vocal strain must be significant." He was worried about her throat. Zareth had produced a sound designed to induce paralytic terror, and Jake was concerned about the potential for vocal damage. "The other officers were terrified," she pointed out. "They were startled," Jake corrected gently. "That's different from being terrified. They knew it was a training exercise, so they knew you weren't going to actually hurt them. Being startled by a loud noise is just a natural reflex." Zareth realized that Jake had completely reframed what he had witnessed. Instead of seeing a predator demonstrating her dominance over lesser creatures, he had seen a professional doing her job with skill and care. He had watched the same exercise that would have sent most species fleeing in terror, and he had seen artistry, precision, and restraint. "You are not afraid of what I can do," she said, and it was not a question. "Should I be?" Jake asked, echoing his response from their first meeting. "You just spent 5 minutes demonstrating perfect control under pressure. If anything, watching you work makes me feel safer, not more afraid." Zareth sat down heavily in her chair, feeling like the universe had shifted around her once again. She had shown Jake Miller her true nature, had demonstrated the killing capabilities that made her species legendary throughout the galaxy. His response had been to worry about her well-being and compliment her technique. She looked at Jake's notebook, which was filled with sketches from the exercise. He had drawn her in action, but instead of capturing her as a monster or a killing machine, he had somehow made her look heroic. The drawings showed her protecting the holographic civilians, carefully controlling her strength, moving with purpose and grace rather than mindless violence. "How do you see me?" Zareth asked quietly. Jake considered the question seriously, looking up from his notebook with those calm brown eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. "I see someone who's incredibly skilled at what she does," he said finally. "Someone who's been given enormous responsibility and handles it with more care than most people would. Someone who could probably hurt anyone she wanted to, but chooses not to." He paused, tilting his head thoughtfully. "I see someone who might be a little lonely," he added gently. "It must be hard, being so much stronger than everyone else. People probably keep their distance even when they don't need to." Zareth felt something crack inside her chest, something she had not even realized was there until it broke. For 30 years, she had been exactly what Jake described, alone, isolated by her own capabilities, surrounded by colleagues who respected her but never truly relaxed in her presence. Until now. Until this strange human who looked at her predatory nature and saw loneliness instead of threat, skill instead of savagery, choice instead of instinct. Jake Miller was not afraid of her because he saw her as she had never seen herself, not as a weapon, but as a person who happened to be very good at violence. That night, Zareth could not sleep. She lay in her quarters, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what had happened to her carefully ordered worldview. Everything she thought she knew about predator and prey relationships had been turned upside down by one unremarkable human who refused to acknowledge that he should be afraid. She found herself thinking about Jake's words from earlier that day. He had called her lonely, and the observation had cut deeper than any weapon ever could. She was lonely, she realized. 30 years of being the most dangerous thing in any room had left her isolated in ways she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. The next morning, she requested one final interview with Jake. This time, she was not trying to establish dominance or test his responses. This time, she simply wanted to understand. Jake arrived at the examination room with his usual cheerful demeanor, settling into his chair across from her with that same relaxed posture that had confused her from the beginning. He opened his notebook and smiled at her, waiting patiently for whatever questions she might have. "I need to understand something," Zareth said without preamble. "You have seen what I am capable of. You know that I could kill you in dozens of different ways, yet you show no fear, no defensive behavior, no appropriate survival responses. Why?" Jake considered her question carefully, the way he seemed to consider everything. "I suppose it's because fear and trust are different things," he said finally. "I'm not afraid of you because I trust you not to hurt me. You've had dozens of opportunities to cause harm, and you haven't taken any of them. That tells me more about who you are than all the combat demonstrations in the galaxy." "But I am a predator," Zareth insisted. "I am designed to hunt and kill. Every instinct I possess drives me toward violence." "Maybe," Jake agreed. "But you choose what to do with those instincts. Having the capacity for violence doesn't make you violent any more than having the capacity for kindness makes someone kind. It's the choices you make that define who you are." Zareth felt that crack in her chest widening. "You think I am kind?" "I think you're trying to be," Jake said gently. "I think you've spent your whole life being told that you're a weapon, and you've started to believe it. But weapons don't worry about whether they're hurting people. Weapons don't show restraint in combat exercises. Weapons don't ask questions about other species' well-being." He was right, and Zareth knew it. Every interaction she had observed between Jake and others had been colored by his genuine concern for their comfort and safety. He had extended the same consideration to her, treating her not as a threat to be managed, but as a person deserving of respect and understanding. "Tell me about fear," she said. "What frightens your species?" Jake's expression grew more serious, and for the first time since she had met him, Zareth saw something that might have been pain in his eyes. "We're afraid of being alone," he said quietly. "We're afraid of not mattering, of living and dying, without making any difference in the world. We're afraid of causing harm to others, of being remembered as something cruel or destructive." He paused, looking down at his hands. "We're afraid of becoming the kind of people who hurt others because it's easier than helping them," he continued. "We're afraid of losing the part of ourselves that cares about strangers, that wants to make things better instead of just safer." Zareth began to understand something that chilled her more than any physical threat ever could. Jake was not fearless. He was afraid of entirely different things. He was more terrified of being cruel than of being killed, more worried about failing to help than about personal danger. "Tell me about your parents," she said gently. Jake's face went very still, and Zareth realized she had touched on something painful. When he spoke again, his voice was soft and careful. "They died when I was 12, he said. "There was an accident. At the terraforming station where they worked. A reactor failure. I was visiting my grandmother on Earth when it happened, so I wasn't there. I am sorry for your loss, Zareth said, meaning it. Jake nodded his thanks before continuing. After the funeral, I went back to the station. There was no one left there except the automated systems, but someone needed to take care of the botanical. Samples my parents had been cultivating. I stayed for 2 years before a rescue ship finally found me. Zareth felt her blood run cold. You were alone for 2 years? As a child? It wasn't so bad, Jake said, though his smile was sadder than before. I had the plants to take care of, and the station's library had thousands of books. I learned a lot about different species during those 2 years. It's actually where I first read about the Veltari. You could have died, Zareth said. Maybe, Jake agreed. But the plants would have died for certain if I had left. My parents spent their whole lives working to create new strains that could help terraform hostile worlds. I couldn't let that work die with them. Zareth stared at him, finally understanding the true source of his fearlessness. Jake Miller was not brave because he did not understand danger. He was brave because he had already faced the worst thing that could happen to him and survived it. He had spent 2 years alone with nothing but his determination to preserve his parents' work, and that experience had taught him that physical threats were temporary, while the loss of meaning was permanent. The worst part wasn't thinking I might die, Jake said quietly, confirming her realization. The worst part was thinking that no one would remember the little things about them, like how my mom hummed when she worked with the plants, or how my dad always saved the last piece of fruit for whoever looked hungriest at dinner. So you chose to remember, Zareth said. I chose to continue, Jake corrected, to keep doing the kind of work they did, caring for things that couldn't care for themselves. It seemed like the best way to honor their memory. Zareth finally understood why Jake's response had chilled her so deeply. It was not that humans lacked fear, it was that their fear operated on a completely different level than hers. Where she feared death and pain and physical defeat, Jake feared meaninglessness and cruelty and the loss of compassion. She realized that this difference extended to humanity as a whole. They were not the galaxy's apex predators, but they might be something far more dangerous, a species that viewed every other being as inherently worthy of care and protection, even at the cost of their own safety. Your species terrifies me, Zareth said honestly. Jake looked surprised. Why? Because you are not afraid of the things that should frighten you, she explained. You look at creatures designed to kill you and see beings worthy of understanding. You face extinction-level threats with curiosity instead of survival instinct. You would rather die helping others than live by harming them. She paused, trying to find words for the revelation that was still forming in her mind. In a galaxy built on the predictable mathematics of self-preservation, humans represent a completely unknown variable, she continued. You might willingly sacrifice yourselves for complete strangers. That unpredictability makes you more dangerous than any weapon. Jake considered this for a long moment. Dangerous to who? To anyone whose power depends on others being afraid, Zareth said. To any system built on the assumption that self-interest will always triumph over compassion. To the natural order that has governed galactic civilization for thousands of years. She thought about the report she would have to write, the recommendations she would make to the Galactic Council. How could she explain that humans were not a threat because of their capacity for violence, but because of their capacity for selflessness? Will you recommend that my species be restricted or controlled? Jake asked, and there was no fear in the question, only curiosity about her decision-making process. No, Zareth said after a long pause. I will recommend that we approach humans with extreme caution, not because you are violent, but because you are the first species we have encountered that might be genuinely good. She began composing her report in her mind, trying to capture the magnitude of what she had discovered. Humans were not just another species to be cataloged and managed. They were something entirely new in the galaxy's experience, a form of intelligence that operated on principles that most civilizations had never even considered. "There is something you should know," Jake said quietly. "About why I'm really here?" Zarath looked at him with renewed attention. "I volunteered for this mission," Jake continued. "When Earth received the invitation to send a representative for evaluation, I was one of hundreds who applied. Do you know why?" Zarath shook her head. "Because I wanted to meet you," Jake said simply. "All of you. Every species in the galaxy. I wanted to learn about your cultures, your histories, your hopes and fears. I wanted to understand what makes each of you unique and beautiful." He smiled, and Zarath saw in that expression something she was finally ready to recognize, not the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger than fear. "I'm not afraid of you because I don't want to be," Jake said. "Fear closes doors, builds walls, creates enemies where there don't need to be any. I'd rather risk being hurt than miss the chance to make a friend." Zarath felt the last of her old certainties crumble away. She had spent her entire career studying species through the lens of threat assessment, evaluating their capacity for violence and their potential for subjugation. She had never considered that the most important question might not be how dangerous they were, but how much they cared about others. "I believe my evaluation is complete," she said finally. Jake nodded and began gathering his things. As he stood to leave, he paused and looked back at her. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're exactly the kind of person the galaxy needs. Strong enough to protect others, wise enough to know when protection isn't needed, and brave enough to question your own assumptions." After he left, Zarath sat alone in the examination room for a long time, staring at the gouges her claws had left in the metal table. Tomorrow, she would submit her report to the Galactic Council, and everything would change. The galaxy was about to encounter a species that did not fit into any of the established categories, a form of intelligence that operated on principles, of compassion rather than dominance. She thought about Jake Miller, alone on a terraforming station for 2 years, caring for plants because it was what his parents would have wanted. She thought about his sister Amy, nursing predators back to health. She thought about his friend Pete, swimming with sharks because he wanted to understand them better. Humanity was coming to the stars, and they were bringing with them a way of thinking that would either transform galactic civilization or terrify it into defensive action. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. Zarath began typing her report, and her final words would echo through the halls of power across a dozen star systems. "Recommend extreme caution in all future interactions with humans. They are not dangerous because they lack fear. They are dangerous because they fear the right things. In a galaxy built on the predictable mathematics of self-preservation, they represent something we have never encountered before, a species that might choose to save us from ourselves."